Okay, class. Today is Thursday, April 30th, at least in your world. And we are kind of coming to the end of this unit. We're going to be testing next week. Today, I'm going to review the formative that you did yesterday. We're going to talk about Native American protests, and we're going to give you another formative. Remind you that tomorrow we're going to have Friday Fun Day. We'll draw more Document of the Week passes, and Documents of the Week will start up again next week, starting with May 4th. So, let's take a look at our objectives first. We're going to talk about who stood up for Hispanic Americans and Native Americans and what the letters stood for. So actually, this is a repeat objective. Yesterday we talked about Hispanic Americans, and they were represented by the UFW, United Farm Workers. Today we're going to talk about Native Americans and groups that stood up for them. A little off in our notes here. Actually, though, we want to review the formative from the day before that first. So a lot of you got this feedback right away when you did the formative. Remember, the formative is not a grade. It's to let you know what we're doing. And it may, Google may be kicking back a grade to you that will not grade the 2 point short response. So you may have had a 3 and think, oh my gosh, I should have had a 5. You may. I just have to hand grade those written responses out. So it's only going to be able to grade the multiple choice where there's a clear right answer. Okay, so let's go over these answers so you know how you did. Women borrowed protest techniques and strategies from what successful movement before them? Well, they borrowed it from the civil rights movement, the SCLC and organizations like that, CORE, etc. What year did the Equal Rights Amendment pass? Unfortunately, so far, it has not passed. Maybe I shouldn't say never. Maybe I should say not yet. What famous book revived the women's rights movement? Well, the feminine mystique, which seems seems pretty much common sense. The one that talks about women. What group represented the causes of women? And make sure you give the letters and describe one goal of the group. So, National Organization of Women, now, and you'd have to know again what those letters stand for, National Organization of Women. And one goal could be uh, equal pay. Another one could be more management positions. Any of the things we discussed in that women's rights movement. But you just can't say more rights or goodness gracious, don't say the right to vote because that's been 100 years. This now that actually this year it's 100 years that women have had the right to vote. So that's not the cause they're fighting for in the 60s and 70s. All right. So yesterday we talked about Hispanic Americans, who makes them up, what some of the goals were. And today we're going to talk about Native American protest. And then there's a formative that goes with those two smaller sections. So let's talk a little bit about Native Americans. Now, when we talk about Native Americans, statistically, I cannot assess to you which minority groups suffer the most. I don't think that's something you can actually measure, but you can measure certain things. And I will say that in terms of measurables, they unfortunately have the greatest disadvantages in numerics here. 38% of Native Americans lived in poverty, 50% were unemployed, and 50% dropped out of high school. And if you don't think that dropout rate and unemployment rate and poverty are all related, then I just don't know what to tell you. I promise you they are related. So those are some pretty appalling statistics. And so, of course, Native Americans wanted to fight to improve their standing and to improve their lives. And you're going to see a renewed movement in the 60s and 70s, again, inspired by, like all these groups are, African American civil rights to make better, to make life better and to make these changes. So, some of the things they did, again, remember, you're only taking the highlighted notes. That's what's fair game on the test. They did negotiate with museums because they said, hey, this isn't like some lost society. We are still here. You shouldn't be having things that you stole from our culture in your museum unless we give it to you. They negotiated though with the government for land claims. This is, I think, one of the biggest points. There is treaty after treaty that shows that Native Americans in official treaties with the US government were entitled to certain lands that were simply ignored and taken away from them. I know that there are some among you who will say, hey, we went to war with these tribes and we won. Therefore, we get this. Okay, if that is your approach, and That can be. Please remember, we're not even doing that. There are treaties on the books that have vast land claims. And we're talking about almost all of Connecticut, for example. It is just technically supposed to be in the hands of Native American tribes because of existing treaties with the United States that simply were ignored. So they also fought for self determination on the reservation, and that is something that you'll see they won. That every nation, like the Sioux Nation, uh, any other native group you could think of, they have their own government and they are technically their own nation, like a little island within the United States, where they have different laws and different rules. So that is something they fought for and did win in that era. But some took more radical action. Some were frustrated. Some were essentially saying, we've been doing the sorts of things Dr. King has been doing for 100 years as well, and we're not getting anywhere. So they sort of were a little bit more willing to have a little bit more radical of an approach. And so the organization that I think is most famously affiliated with Native American improvements and Native American advocacy would be the American Indian Movement, or AIM, American Indian Movement. This is, like so many of these other groups, like all of these other groups, still around today. We'll come back to the Bellevue Redmen. We'll get there. So this is the AIM website today. Their logo, I think, is very interesting in that not only is it a peace sign, a hand holding up a peace sign, but if you look closely, it is a Native American profile, and those would be the feathers of his war dress. So if you go to their website, it says Free Red Dawn. Now you might be, or excuse me, Red Fawn. Red Fawn is a Native American female activist who was arrested. I'm going to say 2018. It's fairly recently for protesting the placement of a pipeline through Native American lands that many Native Americans fear will do irreparable damage to the land. And she was arrested. I believe they accused her of firing a gun um, in the air, and I think the other charge might have been having a gun with a felony, something along those lines. And she was sentenced to about 5 years in jail. So Native Americans are still protesting. There are still encroachments upon their lands. And again, this is very much living history. So Native Americans had a lot of issues they were fighting for. And in the 70s, they were a little bit more willing to be, at least AIM was, to be a little bit more aggressive. And in 1973, the Sioux Nation, at least the Oglala Sioux, there are different nations within that nation, seized the town of Wounded Knee. Sorry, that's cut off a little bit there. Wounded Knee is important because it is a location of an 1890 Native American massacre, many of which who were killed were women and children. And again, there's a long history to that. This is really not in our objectives, but there's really no, it's not a battle. It's not, there's no good reason. It is really part of the long history of the United States, very uneasy and, I don't know, heavy handed approach to dealing with the original settlers of, or the original inhabitants of what we think of as the United States. And so the Oglala Sioux seized this town to sort of remind the world of what had happened in 1890. And they essentially encircled this town and made fortifications and said, all white people out. And given their experience, I don't advocate violence, but I understand the motivations that they felt. And so this made big national news, which again was a big part of why they were trying to do what they were doing. Now, unfortunately, this led to people being killed on both sides, a few. Um, and I believe there's still, I think Leonard Peltier, not 100% sure, is still in jail for the crimes, being accused of the crimes committed in 73 for the deaths of a U.S. Marshal. I think there were two U.S. Marshal killed in the 1973 case. I'm going to link a quick video that you don't have to watch, but it shows in 1973 the Oscars, which you'd say would be unrelated. But that year, probably the only 1973 movie you've ever heard of, The Godfather, was a big hit, and Marlon Brando received the Academy Award for Best Actor. He was so in favor of AIM and their stand at Wounded Knee that he sent a Native American representative to reject the Oscar or not accept the Oscar, and then give a brief speech about what was going on with Native Americans in the world at that time. And again, it's like a 2.5 minute appearance of a young lady who represented, I can't again remember off the top of my head, a particular Native American tribe, and just shows you this was a big deal then and now. I will say today, some of the more common issues you will see AIM fight would be the idea of having Native American mascots. So I will, I'll start off with this one. This is a local school district, and I'm not trying to pick on them, but I will say that if you look at their mascot, that's actually an honorable portrayal. That is not a cartoonish portrayal of a Native American. I think that is a noble portrayal. But let's be honest, the name, the Redmond, which is used by many different school districts, this is just the local one I could think of. I want you to wrap your head around what that name is. I don't know that we would do that with any other group. Uh, Essentially, and again, here's some others, and we'll talk about, for example, the Washington Redskins. Think of another group. You would just never insert skin color into the name of another sports team. I just can't imagine it ever happening. Yet for some reason, maybe because it's such a small group, Native Americans are less than 1% of the US population. Um, Maybe for some reason, then we seem to think that that's okay, but obviously this is not. Another major offender of this, and I again, I'm a big baseball fan, so I have to admit that, for a long time, I just didn't even think about this image of the Cleveland Indians. I had it on several items of clothing. I think I had a tie with it on. I didn't think about what that image portrayed. This is not a this is not a Native American. Unlike, I'll even say, the Bellevue Redmond, that is an actual image of a Native American. This is not an image of a Native American. That is an image of a cartoon, an offensive cartoon called Chief Wahoo. And again, I think when I was younger in particular, I just didn't think a thing of it. But listen, there is no Chief Wahoo. That doesn't even make sense. It is an offensive, cartoonish image. And I get it why so many Native Americans are so very offended by the idea of these cartoonish images meant to portray Native Americans. And it just, again, it doesn't make sense. By the way, the Cleveland Indians have moved to the Block C as their official symbol on their uniforms. And so that's what you're going to see moving forward. I would think that that would, you know, be logical for you. Maybe some of you are holdouts though and want Chief Wahoo. That's fine. Um, that's your choice. There are other teams, the Atlanta Braves. I think a lot of that is some of the things they do at the stadium as well. Again, the Washington Redskins, which we discussed a little bit. Again, I think if you are this guy, you would have a hard time believing that this guy is honoring you. I think that you would just be, again, offended. But that's my opinion. It is certainly up for your interpretation. I will say that at this time, signs like this appeared outside of many reservations. No outside white visitors allowed because of your failure to obey the laws of our tribe as well as the laws of your own. This village is hereby closed. And Native Americans did start to win the right to assert their own laws. So, maybe some of you have noticed that there are, for example, casinos throughout the United States on Native American reservations. That is because they won the right to create their own laws within their nation, and some figured out that this was a loophole to create money for their citizens. And so they legalized gambling in their nation, which is often within an area that did not allow gambling within the United States. So people would come to these casinos because there was a need, not need, demand for gambling, and they were able to create some revenue for their nations. Um, Challenges through the court, again, like you saw so many groups in this era, Native Americans were going through the court system trying to win some of these rights. And in general, Native Americans were suing for land settlements. The government always preferred to settle in cash. They would much rather give cash because it is a one time payment. Native Americans would much rather have land, something that their nation could have and hold on to and pass down for generations. Money, even though we're talking about some big numbers here, has a tendency to, be spent and disappear and hard to give to your grandchildren, your great grandchildren, whereas land you often can. So, some significant settlements. I'm not going to make you know all of these settlements. Just know that they won many of these cases. In 1971, they won 40 million acres of land in Alaska. So, those Native Americans you would know as the Eskimo, and there's other names for those tribes, but I mean, that's a lot of land. And also $962 million. But again, in 1980 and 88, you look at these major settlements, they they won cash, not the land. And then finally, I'll show you a quick map. Here are many of the nations, and you can see there's one in Michigan, a few in New York, many more out west. But again, this is a land that was this was all ruled obviously by Native Americans at one point in our history, but now we are down to less than 1% of the population. Okay. Today, the only other thing I'd like you to do is a formative that ties into Hispanic American rights and Native American rights. It's really big to make sure you know for all these groups, women, Native Americans, Hispanic Americans, the groups that are representing them, maybe some of the goals that they have, and what those letters stand for in those groups. So American Indian Movement, United Farm Workers, National Organization of Women, etc. Here's a quick reminder or look at some of them. You may know some of these. If we're looking at AIM, you're looking at the American Indian Movement. That's what it stands for. There's their symbol again. I'm not exactly sure who this is. This might be Russell Means. He was the leader of AIM during Wounded Knee. Not 100% sure. Now, National Organization of Women. That's Betty Friedan, the author of course, The Feminine Mystique, and United Farm Workers. This is Cesar Chavez, and he led that organization. And we, again, will have remind you of some of the things that he fought for. So, United Farm Workers, let's see, AIM, and National Organization of Women. Okay, very good. Ladies and gentlemen, stay healthy out there. And tomorrow we will make sure you get your Friday Fun Day and watch for those tickets being drawn so that you can get a 10 out of 10 for free on next week's Document of the Week. All right, stay safe.